And we are being live streamed, so good evening, everyone on YouTube. And we are in our regular Monday night session of the Carl Jung Depth Psychology Reading Group. And tonight, we're going to be reading about differentiating between the ego and the unconscious. And let's see, where did that go? I hope you can see that. Oh, okay. All right. So I'm reluctant. I'll tell you what, I'm going to be kind to Jordan because he always gets the long paragraphs. And I'll give him.
They're actually my favorite ones. So, I mean,
Pardon?
They're my favorite ones because it's like, that's kind of how I talk in one long paragraph thought. And so when they go on for pages and pages, I just smile bigger and bigger.
Okay, well, I read Animal Farm for 45 minutes this afternoon, so I'm gonna I'll take 341 then, unless
330.
No, it's paragraph 341, page 212.
Oh, that's right. I missed last week. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, I did as well.
Yeah, we finished off the anima and the animus.
Does LaDonna have a copy?
Pardon?
Does LaDonna?
I think she does, yeah. Although she's not going to be reading it probably, but so Brian, why don't
so then if so, we can go to part 3.
Right. Okay. All right, I will read 341. All right, so this is the beginning of part 3 of volume 7 of the collected works of C.G. Jung. And we're beginning with paragraph 341. And the topic is the technique of differentiation between the ego and the figures of the unconscious. Now, that doesn't mean the difference between the ego and the unconscious. He's talking about the difference between the ego and the figures that he kind of bumps into in the Red Book, I think. So I'm gonna read paragraph 341. I owe it to the reader to give him or her a detailed example of the specific activity of the animus and anima. Unfortunately, this material is so enormous and demands so much explanation of symbols that I cannot include such an account within the compass of this essay. I have, however, published some of these products with all their symbolic associations in a separate book, which is called Symbols of Transformation. And this I must refer, and to this I must refer the reader. In that book, I said nothing about the animus because at the time this function was still unknown to me. Nevertheless, if I advise a woman patient to associate her unconscious contents, she will always produce the same kind of fantasy. The masculine hero figure who almost unfailingly appears is the animus, and the succession of fantasy experiences demonstrates the gradual transformation and dissolution of the autonomous complex. Okay, let me read the last sentence again. The masculine hero figure who always unfailingly appears is the animus. This is for women. And the succession of fantasy experience demonstrates the gradual transformation and dissolution of the autonomous complex.
So that would seem to me to say the autonomous complex would kind of be, well, it's the complex that you're unconsciously being driven by. It's like an autonomic function. And in that sense, gradually transforming it to dissolve the autonomic part and bring it more into useful psychic nourishing contents.
Consciousness so that you know what's going on when you're getting pushed one way or another.
Right.
And
Right.
the autonomous complex tends to be as if a separate personality.
Right.
And so I
Which
would
is
think that-
projected often, right?
Mhm.
So,
Yeah, and even in brain spotting, the things like the manager part, the part that would hijack your mouth, kind of thing with a trauma trigger. I always referred to it as healthy NPD. It's like healthy multiple personality disorder because it was the natural piece rather than the Jekyll and Hyde piece.
well, it would be, I think, for the benefit of our guest here, I would say that it would be like going to a cocktail party where there's going to be a famous man of some sort, either a famous professor or a famous sport figure, famous politician, what have you. And if you feel like that's the perfect man, then you're projecting the animus onto that person. Okay. And of course, if it's less than, the NFL or something like that, if it's in your local cocktail party circuit and a man comes into the circuit that you're really impressed with, you might consider having a little fling with that guy, except that if you are able to transform this animus into something that drives you, you could say, oh yeah, I recognize that. he's not going to look so perfect in 3 days or whatever it is. And I should stop projecting that. And so anyway, other comments?
Well, I also think that this, these fantasies have succession and they sort of play out and the old ones tend to sort of dissipate. So I think that there's this gradual bringing into consciousness from the unconscious and then having interaction with it and processing and metabolism, and then moving on to the next sort of tableau. It's like,
Well,
no, this is what this is like now.
Yeah. Well, I have this direct experience because I ran into this woman who I've now been together with for 37 years. And the first time I met her, man, I was decapitated. And I just was totally unreasonable about my thinking about her. And we actually became the first couple to meet online and marry and nobody understood what that meant back in the day. And so we were the first ones really doing it. I mean, others were sending email back and forth, but we're the first couple to meet that way and then have a courtship of 4 months. And after that 4 months, I left my wife of 17 years and moved in with Debbie, and that was the end of it. That was the end of my first marriage. So I know how this can operate from a male point of view with the anima. Now, in later iterations, haven't gone quite so far, but I've definitely had that anima tug on multiple occasions.
Well, I think that your and Debbie's example is a really prominent one because a lot of people you will hear saying, oh, well, instant chemistry is just a trauma bond, and trauma bonds don't last 37 years. That's going to be a 2-year torturous, something. So
nobody knows about trauma bonds, Jordan. Not everybody's going to think of that. Come on.
Well, if I say it in a different way, then Skip,
say it in a different way.
A different way of if you're operating with a minor complex from some kind of adverse experience you've had in your past,
Yeah.
i.e. trauma, and you don't know it. And then someone else basically has a magnetic template that just sticks the same way, either by similarity of your mentor or your tormentor. Then, whichever part the parent played, then what happens is you both enter into a relationship and it starts to become what a normal parent is mentor, tormentor, both. So I think at that point, trauma bond is simply things that are unresolved, that are unconsciously driving you along. And then you see that projection just naturally received in another person. And in a sense, even if you weren't doing it anymore, typically it will resurrect the projection.
Right. And so, right. Okay, I guess that's enough. So Brian, did you want to say something or
I was
read?
going to say, I think the work that can happen if the sort of the tabula rasa, or that, I don't know what you want to call it, the substrate, the person, the actual person
Mhm.
who gets a projection onto her, that as time goes by, those projections shatter, or they unplug and lose their energy. They fall away, they get withdrawn, and progressively you're in a relationship with a person.
Right.
And if it sounds to me like you were also a good match despite the projection.
Yes,
And
absolutely.
so as those kind of peeled away and you processed and metabolized your anima projections, plural, probably.
And this was long before I was studying Jung. So I didn't know any of this. I never studied psychology. I just knew that my first wife was driving me out of the marriage, and Debbie was, what I wanted at that time, no doubt. So anyway, why don't you? I think we've probably mashed that one to death over the last few weeks. So why don't you go ahead, Brian, with 342?
Oh no, I just put an IKEA cookie. My wife went to IKEA today, and she brought me these little ginger snaps that I can't really control myself around.
Do you have to put the cookies together yourself from IKEA?
I'm sorry?
Do they come pre-assembled, the cookies from IKEA?
Yeah, but in a container, I had to disassemble.
Uh-huh.
This transformation is the aim of the analysis of the unconscious. If there's no transformation, it means that the determining influence of the unconscious is unabated, and that it will, in some cases, persist in maintaining neurotic symptoms in spite of all our analysis and all our understanding. Alternatively, a compulsive transference will take hold, which is just as bad as a neurosis. Obviously, in such cases, no amount of suggestion, goodwill, and purely reductive understanding has helped to break the power of the unconscious. This is not to say, once again, I would like to emphasize this point very clearly, that all psychotherapeutic methods are, by and large, useless. I merely want to stress the fact that there are not a few cases where the doctor has to make up his mind to deal fundamentally with the unconscious, to come to a real settlement with it. This is, of course, something very different from interpretation. In the latter case, it is taken for granted that the doctor knows beforehand, so as to be able to interpret. But in the case of a real settlement, it is not a question of interpretation. It is a question of releasing unconscious processes and letting them come into the conscious mind in the form of fantasies. We can try our hand at interpreting these fantasies if we like. In many cases, it may be quite important for the patient to have some idea of the meaning of the fantasies produced, but it is of vital importance that he or she should experience them to the full, and insofar as intellectual understanding belongs to the totality of the experience, also understand them. Yet I would not give priority to understanding. Naturally, the doctor must be able to assist the patient in his understanding, but Since he will not and indeed cannot understand everything, the doctor should assiduously guard against clever feats of interpretation. For the important thing is not to interpret and understand the fantasies, but primarily to experience them. Alfred Kuben has given a very good description of the unconscious in his book, Die andere Seite, The Other Side. That is, he has described what he, as an artist, experienced of the unconscious. It is an artistic experience which, in the deeper meaning of human experience, is incomplete. I would like to recommend an attentive reading of this book to everybody who is interested in these questions. He or she will then discover the incompleteness I speak of. The vision is experienced artistically, but not humanly. By human experience, I mean that the person of the author should not just be included passively in the vision, but that he should or she should face the figures of the vision actively and reactively with full consciousness. I would level the same criticism at the authoress of the fantasies dealt with in the book mentioned above. She too merely stands opposite the fantasies, forming themselves out of the unconscious, perceiving them, or at best passively enduring them. But a real settlement with the unconscious demands a firmly opposed conscious standpoint.
Yeah.
So it sounds very much like what he was doing in the Red Book.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the oppositorum and the conjunctionist and the oppositorum, both the conjunction and the opposition.
But also to have feeling, to have an
Right.
affective experience with these figures, images,
Mhm.
these personalities, and not just to sort of examine them or
Yeah,
perceive,
but
but really
he's saying
engage.
to live them rather than understand them. So like you experience art in a museum, you get tingles if it's beautiful to you, kind of thing. You're living, you don't need to understand it. That you're doing the same thing with these contents.
Right. Okay. So the important thing here is that you actually have to be having an experience. You can't be above the fray, whether
Right.
it's in whether you're working with your unconscious or your conscious. You can't be above the fray and just be like at a movie where you just see these images flop by and then, oh, well, that was fun. I'm glad I spent the $10, whatever it is now. I haven't been to a movie theater in 3 years. So,
That's a really good point. That's
yeah,
a really
but it's not that. I mean, you're not sitting in a comfortable lounge chair with a big thing of popcorn and just being entertained by something that's flicking on the screen. You're actually in it and experiencing it. Right.
Yeah,
exactly. I think even if someone goes to the eye of the storm, so to speak, they become a spectator of the storm. Instead of that grace under fire is that you yourself are the eye in the storm and are able to live in it rather than, abandon it to go to the part where you can watch the ring of it around you.
Yeah.
From the
So the way this happened to me was I got going on this novel, and literally the lead character came into my bedroom and woke me up every morning. I mean, I remember her coming to my bedside and waking me up and telling me, come on now, it's time to do this some more. And so she would not let me alone until I had typed 500 to 1,000 words, until, something of a blivet had happened, and then she'd leave me alone for the rest of the day. But she woke me up at 6 a.m. for 8 months, insisting that I write this story. And finally, when the story was written, then she went away.
Mhm.
But that was very much an experience. And it actually was calling upon a lot of experiences that I had had in, say, the last decade or so.
But
But-
if you've ever read the Red Book, I mean, similarly to this, is that, Jung is full of affect. Like every other sentence, he has like a strong reaction,
Mhm.
through the range, of joy and abhorrence and fear and pity and, on and on. He's just full of affect throughout the whole Red Book as these things moving him. I think that's where some of the power was.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point, because he's expressing the living of the affect, I mean, that he's being affected. I mean, the living of the experience, rather than topically just picture here, listing them along the way.
Yeah. And so anyway, those were quite intense experiences that I had. But when it was over, then it was over. Okay. But I say that was the autobiography of my anima, which is, it's really the story of the first woman prime minister of Japan from age 15 to age 75. And so you wouldn't think it was about me, a Westerner who was living in Japan. And yet that was the experience that my anima had and gave me. Everything in that novel is true and happened to me or someone I know quite closely, one way or another.
Mhm.
And so, so then that's when I was interacting with the figures. And of course, at that point, I had only just started to study Jung. So I didn't really know what it was about, where it was going, and so on. So when it was written, I just put it away for 21 years. And only in 2014, I think I published it on Kindle. I think it's only on Kindle. But
That's this time I've heard that story. I appreciate the example too. It's interesting, as you were mentioning it this time, my whole architectural thesis came to mind. And what was interesting, it was the Temple in Man, and it was a house for myself. And Dylan, I won't go into the polysyllabic mess of the tagline of the thesis. This is about a paragraph long, but it was basically that the home is one psyche turned inside out. That's where collections are. There's further and further degrees of inside. And lo and behold, I find a book called The Temple in Man about the Temple of Luxor at Karnak right after I finished my thesis, thinking I'm being all original. And then this is, published in like 1937 or something.
yeah.
And then I get into Jung after I left college. And lo and behold, the next year, an oil painting series of about 37 paintings just starts dumping out of me. And I've never painted in oils before. And it's called The Temple in Man, but it's about Ichthusa, this fish woman, kind of this mermaidish, and you get Melusina, all these different characters. And what's interesting is I didn't know about the anima at that point. And like you said as well, and then I go back, I start reading Carl Jung, and a year later, I'm looking back at the paintings going, oh, I had to do the vessel for her to come forward. And then when she did, it was a more intense series with the paintings, and mostly dark and bonnet kind of thing. So you said that, because that was prior to when I had that, but I see the correlation now, though, of how important following, you following that tug. No, you're not hitting the snooze button. You got to get up and go do it. So
yeah, and it wasn't subtle. I mean, it was a 15-year-old Japanese girl in a full kimono, beautiful kimono with cherry blossoms on the design, coming and waking me up, and I go, every morning. And then I would go, what I would do is go into my computer, not turn on any lights, because I'm convinced that if you turn lights on, that's going to take you out of your psyche, somewhat at least. And so I wouldn't turn on any lights, just enough light, and I would have only enough light on my screen so that I could see the letters. And then I would just put my hands on the keyboard, and I have no recollection of actually typing. The book just wrote itself.
Right.
So anyway, go ahead. You're going to read next, Jordan.
343. I will try to explain what I mean by an example. One of my patients had the following fantasy. He sees his fiancée running down the road towards the river. It is winter, and the river is frozen. She runs out on the ice, and he follows her. She goes right out, and then the ice breaks. A dark fissure appears, and he is afraid she is going to jump in. And that is what happens. She jumps into the crack, and he watches her sadly. Why don't I read the paragraph that goes after?
I meant for you to read the next paragraph too.
Because it goes with this fragment, although torn out of its context, clearly shows the attitude of the conscious mind. It perceives and passively endures. The fantasy image is merely seen and felt. It is two-dimensional, as it were, because the patient is not sufficiently involved. Therefore, the fantasy remains a flat image, concrete and agitating perhaps, but unreal, like a dream. This unreality comes from the fact that he himself is not playing an active part. If the fantasy happened in reality, he would not be at a loss for some means to prevent his fiancée from committing suicide. He could, for instance, easily overtake her and restrain her bodily from jumping into the crack. Were he to act in reality as he acted in the fantasy, he would obviously be paralyzed, either horror or because of the unconscious thought that he really has no objection to her committing suicide. Okay. The fact that he remains passive in the fantasy merely expresses his attitude to the activity of the unconscious in general. He is fascinated and stupefied by it. In reality, he suffers from all sorts of depressive ideas and convictions. He thinks he is no good, that he has some hopeless hereditary taint, that his brain is degenerating, etc. These negative feelings are so many autosuggestions which he accepts without argument. Intellectually, he can understand them perfectly and recognize them as untrue, but nevertheless, the feelings persist. They cannot be attacked by the intellect because they have no intellectual or rational basis. They are rooted in an unconscious, irrational fantasy life, which is not amenable to conscious criticism. In these cases, the unconscious must be given an opportunity to produce its fantasies, and the above fragment is just such a product of unconscious fantasy activity. Since the case was one of psychogenic depression, the depression itself was due to fantasies of whose existence the patient was totally unconscious. In genuine melancholia, extreme exhaustion, poisoning, etc., the situation would be reversed. The patient has such fantasies because he is in a depressed condition. But in a case of psychogenic depression, he is depressed because he has such fantasies. My patient was a very clever young man who had been intellectually enlightened as to the cause of his neurosis by a lengthy analysis. However, intellectual understanding made no difference to his depression. In cases of this sort, the doctor should spare himself the useless trouble of delving still further into the causality. For when a more or less exhaustive understanding is of no avail, the discovery of yet another little bit of causality will be of no avail either. The unconscious simply has gained an unassailable ascendancy. It wields an attractive force that can validate all conscious contents. In other words, it can withdraw libido from the conscious world and thereby produce a depression, an abaissement du nouveau mental from Genet. But as a result of this, according to the law of energy, expect an accumulation of value, i.e. libido, in the unconscious. Feels like the Robin Hood of the unconscious robbing the libido from the rich of the conscious.
Yeah, it's
Fill up the
taking the libido into the unconscious where the unconscious can work with it.
Yeah.
But it's I guess it's kind of like a child sucking its thumb. A child doesn't know what to do, so it runs home to mama, kind of thing. And so then it's sucking its thumb and stuff is going on around the house. And all of a sudden it sees stuff that's more interesting than just sitting there looking at the inside. And so then the libido comes out one way or another.
Yeah, the drives.
Right. Or it will come out and crying or whatever. And I'll try to get libido from mama.
That's a really good point about the child becoming interested in something else, in a sense, magnetically. Oh, that's more interesting. Because then the curiosity and the wonderment are those kind of click pieces that break the docking clamps of the kid only being interior. And expand allow them to open up, crack the egg, expand, and awaken as it is more and more.
Okay, I'm going to assume that our guest here does not want to read, so I will read on. Libido can never be apprehended except in a definite form. That is to say, it is identical with fantasy images, and we can only release it from the grip of unconscious by bringing up the corresponding fantasy images. That is why, in a case like this, we give the unconscious a chance to bring its fantasies to the surface. This is how the foregoing fragment was produced. It is a single episode from a long and very intricate series of fantasy images corresponding to the quota of energy that was lost to the conscious mind and its contents. The patient's conscious world has become cold, empty, and gray, but his unconscious is activated, powerful, and rich. It is characteristic of the nature of the unconscious psyche that it is sufficient unto itself and knows no human considerations. Once a thing has fallen into the unconscious, it is retained there, regardless of whether the conscious mind suffers or not. The latter can hunger and freeze, while everything in the unconscious becomes verdant and blossoms. Okay.
Yeah, I'm seeing now the image of a volcano under the ocean, one that has not become an island yet. All the gas is nourishing the water. Then in that sense, the unconscious being fueled by the core of the earth, the unconscious as the ocean, or the ocean as the unconscious being fueled by then something further, the core of the earth.
Right. And
seems more appropriate even.
Right. And what was happening to me was, well, this isn't completely so in terms of the time frame, but what was happening to me was I was in Japan for 5 years. I was having a very interesting life. There were lots of cool things that were happening all the time. And then I come back to the United States, and my ex-wife just expected me to set up a practice in my hometown and do wills and real estate closings. And that was never going to happen.
Yeah,
that wasn't happening.
Boring. Yeah, you're like,
Yeah, and she became more and more intransigent about it. And ultimately I met this woman online. I didn't even see her physically until we'd been communicating for a week, and boom, that was it. I mean, when I physically saw her, and she was very clever because she wore a bright red fire engine red silk dress to the event. It just blew me away. So wow, this is more interesting.
Actually, that makes so much more sense, though, that you lived your life. I mean, the swords, the tea, the kimonos, the culture, and you were living life. And then when you come back to America, almost nowhere you go, it's going to be anywhere you go, it's going to be boring, and so that's actually it feels like that puts such a contrast. And then I love the red dress piece, because then you're going, this is a no-brainer kind of choice.
Right. And of course, after that happened and the libido did come out, then I founded a company that 12 years later became a public company. And allowed me to, that particular company allowed me to fly around the world about 30 times, at least 30 times. And so, so I did get to experience this big international life. It wasn't what I had expected. I mean, I thought I would get a job in the State Department or something like that. But, in business, you're basically a diplomat too. And you have to be even a better one, I suppose. Get people to buy what you're selling. Okay, Brian, 346.
Okay. Libido can never be apprehended except in a definite form. That is to say, it is identical with fantasy images.
We can only...
Yeah, that's the one I just read. So 346.
Oh, I see. I'm sorry, 346. So at least it appears at first. But when we look deeper, we find that this unconcern of the unconscious has a meaning, indeed a purpose and a goal. There are psychic goals that lie beyond the conscious goals. In fact, they may even be inimical to them. But we find that the unconscious has an inimical or ruthless bearing towards the conscious only when the latter adopts a false or pretentious attitude.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, Jordan, you want to go for the next one, 347?
Yeah, I was just looking up inimical. I hadn't heard it in so long to obstruct or harm. 347, the conscious attitude of my patient is so one-sidedly intellectual and rational that nature herself rises up against him or her, annihilates his whole world of conscious values. But he cannot de-intellectualize himself and make himself dependent on another function, e.g. feeling, example given, feeling, for the very simple reason that he has not got it. The unconscious has it. Therefore, we have no alternative but to hand over the leadership to the unconscious and give it the opportunity of becoming a conscious content in the form of fantasies. If formerly my patient clung to his intellectual world and defended himself with rationalizations against what he regarded as his illness, he must now yield himself up to it entirely. And when a fit of depression comes upon him, he must no longer force himself to some kind of work in order to forget, but must accept his depression and give it a hearing.
Yeah.
I love the don't waste trouble part of that.
So only if only all the people that are on antidepressant drugs in this country would do this, they might find their way out without drugs. And certainly, one of the reasons I've stuck with Jung so long is because it has always seemed to me that whatever I needed at any given time, he was presenting to me. And of course, what was really happening was that he was opening up my unconscious by forcing me to think about these various issues. And when your unconscious is open, the healing power comes in. Okay, this is where we get Lawrence Yaffe saying that the whole purpose of Jungian psychology is to bring you closer to the healing power, which is the unconscious. And if you tap into it once, each time you tap into it, it's going to start feeding you the things you need to heal.
Mhm.
Okay, that's what it does. And that's what it does, whether you're in a psychotherapy session or in a church service, or just in your art of, you could be an organist, or you could be a trumpeter, or you could be Picasso, whoever it is. But once you're in the unconscious, then you're being fed. And you have to, if you appreciate that that's what's going to happen, then this healing power will come to you, even if
Well,
not directly. I mean, it doesn't necessarily come by rational means where if you do this, this will happen.
Right.
No, it's if you open this door and go through it, now the unconscious will give you what you need. Okay. And so that's what it did. That's what my unconscious did. It, I can't draw a direct link, a causality between writing that novel and my business career over the next 12 years. But holy smokes, many other people that have done that in their career.
Right.
Not much.
Well, it's interesting. I won't give up gender or age, but earlier this year, I had a psychiatrist who had just retired sit at my table.
Mhm.
And I mean, as you know, the people who are Jungian analysts and psychiatrists, like my favorite people to sit down. I'm like, oh, they get it. So we can go a little further. But what was interesting is towards the end, there was I said, well, so you retired, what's next? And the response was, I don't know yet, but I do want to do some kind of psychotherapy without the script pad. And I said, oh, so no medicate before you investigate. Don't drug the deer before you go hunting. And he's like, exactly.
Mhm.
So it was interesting, very heartening to me to see someone in the psychiatric profession who was against the pharma piece in the initial time. He wasn't against all pharma, but
No.
the piece of you've got to get to know what you're dealing with before you can go, stick something in them. Because if you medicate before you investigate, basically, I think that's to me that's actually negligent, and actually it's just lazy, frankly.
Right, and it's part of our drug abuse problem in this country right now, and all the drug deaths, because the mental health people are being required to make a diagnosis in 15 minutes based on the GSM or whatever it is. And then they say, okay, you take this drug and it'll fix you up right up. Well, it will fix your symptoms, but it's not going to get at what's really troubling you, not even close.
Yeah, my storied example is the gardener who goes out and cuts the weed down with scissors right above the ground, and then sits back with his tea in the garden, and look how pretty the flowers are. And then, 2 weeks later, with a vengeance, this weed has come back stronger because all he did is drove the energy to the roots. So he goes back out with his scissors and he cuts it off again. And, that's the, baby, I'm sorry, I'll change my behavior kind of thing, and then 2 weeks later, here comes that thing again. And, so you're absolutely right. You've got to get to the source rather than just nipping the superficial or topical presentation of it.
Right. Okay, Brian, you're up.
Okay, well, I will add that there are people who actually do need medication.
Well, I
Yes.
don't doubt that. And of course, psychiatrists are dealing with actual mental disease or defect, as opposed to psychologists who more tend to be trying to give you a way of coping with your life, I think.
Mhm.
You know,
Yeah, I would just
when
be careful because there are some people who literally,
Mhm.
they may die
yeah,
if
Right.
they're not medicated for a time. And it's usually best if they do both,
hmm
do psychotherapy and in earnest, but some people can't even do the psychotherapy.
right.
So that's just my disclaimer. Okay.
Right, and
That's fine.
let me disclaim, I'm not a mental health professional. Nobody should take mental health advice from me. I'm just talking about my own experience. I don't take drugs. I don't drink alcohol. I don't smoke cigarettes, but I've been doing okay. But
Your point,
I do a lot of Jungian reading.
Yeah, right.
well, your point is, I mean, people like, taking Ritalin and this and that, and just stuff. I mean, aspirin. I mean, I'm not going to go against aspirin. It's good for people, it's blood thinner, etc. But there's always a pill for something. Take
Yeah.
something. And I mean, maybe it's rare. Maybe I'm just, completely unfeeling but I don't get headaches. I mean, to
Mhm.
the point where I got one in college to where I wrote it down in my sketchbook. If in the morning I'm dead, it's because I had an aneurysm. And my thesis mate walked over the next morning and he goes, "You left your sketchbook open and you wrote something a little larger." So I didn't feel any problem just peeking in. He goes, "You did not have an aneurysm." He goes, "That's what's called a headache. All us other poor fools have them all the time. We don't like you very much when you say things like that." So I'm like, "Well,
Yeah.
just go drink some water." He's like, "No, dude, stop it." So I get it. I mean, there's a pill for everything though. With people get used to growing up that they take the Flintstones vitamins, they take this, they take that. There's always something. And it's not
Well, I
just
take pills. I just don't take narcotic drugs. Brian, read on.
And they're all poisons.
Yeah, they're all poison.
They are. So,
They
I
are.
know.
okay,
Yeah.
348. Now, this is the direct opposite of succumbing to a mood, which is so typical of neurosis. It is no weakness, no spineless surrender, but a hard achievement, the essence of which consists in keeping your objectivity despite the temptations of the mood, and in making the mood your object, instead of allowing it to become in you the dominating subject. So the patient must try to get his mood to speak to him. His mood must tell him all about itself and show him through what kind of fantastic analogies it is expressing itself.
And they can become pretty fantastic,
Mhm.
as people see once they pick up the red book. Hello, Patrick. Nice to see Patrick Hollywood here.
nice.
Okay.
Well, I love the fantastic piece too, because I mean, I call that making besties with beasties. And a lot of it's just, how's your inner weather? Let them thunder and storm and rage, but don't respond, but don't not listen fully.
Yeah.
And then ask them, what's your message? Once they, expend themselves. And sometimes they disappear and then they come back with the same kind of ragey stuff. But little by little, I mean, I find them to be some of the best allies because they've been stuck somewhere in there for man, I'd be angry too, honestly.
Yeah. Okay. Jordan, 349.
The foregoing fragment is a bit of visualized mood. If he had not succeeded in keeping his objectivity in relation to his mood, he would have had, in place of the fantasy image, only a crippling sense that everything was going to the devil, that he was incurable, etc. But because he gave his mood a chance to express itself in an image, he succeeded in converting at least a small sum of libido, of unconscious creative energy and eidetic form, into a conscious content and thus withdrawing it from the sphere of the unconscious.
Yeah.
That reminds me of Eric Neumann's this all products should be like symbols. They should be generative, not static, like checking something off a list. So that in
Right.
here, he's saying that this result is generative rather than causatively final. You know, I mean, it's,
Right.
yeah. And mining the unconscious, basically, by standing your ground.
Right. So paragraph 349, the foregoing fragment is is that what you just read?
Yeah, it's just what I just read.
Okay. Paragraph 350. But this effort is not enough. For the fantasy to be completely experienced depends not just perception and passivity, but active participation. The patient would comply with this demand if he concluded himself in the fantasy, as he would doubtless conduct himself in reality. If he conducted himself in the fantasy as he would in the reality, he would never remain an idle spectator while his fiancée tried to drown herself. He would leap up and stop her. This should also happen in the fantasy. If he succeeds in behaving in the fantasy as he would behave in a similar situation in reality, he would prove that he was taking the fantasy seriously, i.e., assigning absolute reality value to the unconscious. In this way, he would have won a victory over his one-sided intellectualism, and indirectly would have asserted the validity of the irrational standpoint of the unconscious. Right. So I guess after 6 years, most people who follow this YouTube channel accept that the unconscious is real, or they wouldn't be here. So I have to ask Patrick, have you gotten your plans to go take Tim up on his offer? And that may not be, that's a private conversation, but okay, Brian, 351.
That would be the, excuse me, that would be the complete experience of the unconscious. Let's see, sorry, that would be the complete experience of the unconscious demanded of him. But one must not underestimate what that actually means. Your whole world is menaced by fantastic irreality. It is almost insuperably difficult to forget, even for a moment, that all this is only fantasy, a figment of the imagination that must strike one as altogether arbitrary and artificial. How can one assert that anything of this kind is real and take it seriously?
I just take it as real because Dr. Jung said is real in Answer to Job, and it is in fact real. It cannot be denied, even though you can't reach out and touch it. Wow, is it real? No doubt.
Yeah, and I think it's real, and at times needs no words. At times the reasons are wholly unreasonable, and it's just it's important to be comfortable with the not knowing. We don't have to talk it to death. We don't have to prove it, explain it. And I think that's the counterpart. It's more of a symbolic, artistic language that goes as basically to fuel the heart of the matter in any intellectual expression. What's the old phrase? You know, oh, sir, that makes way too much sense to be worth a damn. You know, it's like you've pounded the heart of the matter right out of there, so you can go move along, kind of. You know.
Right. Okay, Brian, did you want to say anything more?
No, I think it's just, I think we're about to get the answer to the rhetorical question, but
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so who's next? I lost track here.
I have a question of you two. It sticks out and it's not that big a deal, but the first line of paragraph 351, that would be the complete experience of the unconscious demanded of him. That's a fragment sentence, right? I've never seen Jung use a fragment, and it feels like he cut out something that came right before when edited.
It has a verb.
That would be the complete experience of the unconscious demanded of him.
I think that's,
Wouldn't that would be the complete experience that the unconscious, but even, I don't know.
experience.
Anyway, it's small.
Right.
Not important, but I don't know. It just struck me as an odd sentence.
It is an odd sentence.
Yeah, I mean, I get the concept. I mean, that's more important there, to just, not play stickler editor, but
Hi, Jamie. Nice to see you.
Okay. So who's up for 352?
I'll go. We can hardly be expected to believe in a sort of double life in which we conduct ourselves on one plane as modest average citizens, while on another we have unbelievable adventures and perform heroic deeds. In other words, we must not concretize our fantasies, but there is in humanity a strange propensity to do just this, and all our aversion to fantasy and our critical depreciation of the unconscious comes solely from the deep-rooted fear of this tendency. Concretization and the fear of it are both primitive superstitions, but they still survive in the liveliest form among so-called enlightened people. In his civic life, a person may follow the trade of a shoemaker, but as the member of a sect, they put on the dignity of an archangel. To all appearances, they are small tradesmen, but among the Freemasons, they are a mysterious grandee. Another sits all day in his office, or in the office, at evening in the circle. He is a reincarnation of Julius Caesar, fallible as a man, but in his official capacity, infallible. These are all unintentional concretizations.
Mm-hmm.
I'd add a sidebar of, I laugh. I mean, I'm not going to say it's not valid, but when people do past life regression, it's interesting how everyone is Cleopatra or King Tut or Ramses or Seti or Theodore Roosevelt, but no one finds their older ancestral milkmaid or postman. I mean, it's always some grandiose character. So anyway, that seemed to go along with this of the Julius Caesar in the circle and just a shoemaker at the office.
Yeah. Well, what Dr. Jung was talking about in terms of doing the Red Book, I was reading about this in the Black Books today. I was reading a commentary by Soto Shambasani, who's the expert in these things. And, the point is that once you spit it out, whatever it is concretized. Right. And so you have to move on. But what Jung was about, what he was telling his patients to do is to write it down, like in his Red Book, put it down, go back and refer to it, and it will be like your temple. You don't say that this is this wonderful thing, but, you say, wow, this happened to me one time. I mean, and you say it to yourself, this happened to me one time, and, it was quite special. And, but it isn't, who I am particularly. So I can read a poem that I have read before. Jordan knows this poem. I don't think Brian does. But the interesting thing was the experience I had the day after I wrote this poem. And so keep in mind that the psyche is always looking for its opposite to somehow compensate for the situation. And so the day after I wrote this poem, I was to give a poetry reading in the lobby of the Martin Luther King Library in Washington, D.C. What I didn't know was that the people who would be attending were going to be indigenous Black men for the most part. Okay, so here I am, and this was in 1993. I'm trying to figure out, what is going to appeal to these indigenous Black men. Now, but I didn't know that until I was physically there, right? So I just knew I was going to do this poetry reading. And the day before, I was completing a book by Clarissa Pinkola Estes entitled something like What Women Dream. Okay, I think she took it off the market after I sent her this this poem, because I think I kind of nailed it. But anyway, she talked about all these things that women dream, and so all of a sudden, boom, this poem started to come to me, and I wrote it in 45 minutes. Okay, and I wrote it in a lyrical form, in verse, that I never normally use. But here's the poem: The Whale and the Horse. In fact, I'll show it to everybody so that you can follow along. It's a little easier if you follow along. Okay, here it is. So, The Whale and the Horse. I dreamed I was a mighty whale, and you a majestic white horse, who lived on an arid plain so stale you couldn't find love's source. My habitat was a blue-green cove, where I often swam and dove. And though our forms were sealed by fate, we found we could communicate. You often came to a cliff edge where you could see me swim. You found a path beyond the ledge where you could follow your precious whim to step gingerly down the path through thorns to my white sand beach, where you could touch my warm, moist bath, allowing me to teach of joys of life and joys of love from many years ago, beyond the strife of thorns above, in precious realms below. But when I looked at your foreleg, I saw a bloody stream of bright red ooze from thorny peg, nightmare within a dream. I bade you join my moist pleasure, but you couldn't stand the sting. I gave the secret of my treasure, the balm for which men sing. Your hooves dug deep, you wouldn't weep. You found my amber ball. You stove it in, released within its vapor, raised the paw. Now, free to run and have some fun, you galloped in the surf. You ducked your head into the foam, then dove into my turf. We swam and dove inside my cove until on one deep dive, we surfaced for breath, defeating death, and flew up alive. We flew above your arid plain and dripped our splashing waters, and everywhere our bodies dripped, the trees gave birth to daughters. We cavorted nearly every day until the plain was lush, and then returned unto the bay, where we found your belly plush. With the fruits of love's wisdom transcending our kingdom of time and space we all know, our child brought our freedom to fathom the wisdom of leaving life's flow to love's glow. So that's my little poetry reading for tonight. But what happened then the next day was I asked if anybody wanted me to reread any of the, I don't know, handful of poems, let's say 20 that I had read at my reading. And so all these guys basically it was like a January day. So they were basically getting in and out of the cold. They were homeless. They come into the lobby of the library. They set up chairs for them. And so they're sitting there and they listen to my 20 or so poems. And the only one they wanted me to read again was that one. And I did change one word when I read it, which was that I said, I dreamed that I was a mighty whale and you a majestic black horse. I changed it. I changed the horse from white to black. And, you can imagine now in the fullness of time, I look back at that and I say, wow, wouldn't that be a huge compensation for guys who are living on the street and didn't have much of a life outside of whatever they could eke out of the local library, and so it would really touch them, I think. Any comments about that?
I'd say yes, the arid land, then being fertile, given water, metaphorically, that arid land being their life, devoid of feature, barren as it were, but then by connection becomes fecund and becomes actually verdant.
Mhm.
Actually, verdant and what are the words you used before?
Yeah, so the thing about that poem is it is a concretization. Okay, I acknowledge that. But for them, it would have set a lot of stuff in motion in their psyches, I think. And especially they didn't have it to look at, so they just had to listen to what I said. Yeah. Any comments, Brian?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm not following what he's saying because I think that this process is vital to the work. So I don't know that one isn't, I mean, because that's what he did. He went about his business on a daily basis, saw patients, had dinner with his wife and kids, and was
Mhm.
having this, daily fantasy life for months. So I guess I'm not,
Well, I
maybe,
was obviously having a fantasy life, so
Hmm.
I sent a copy of this to Clarissa Pinkola Estes, and I got some response from her assistant or something, but I think they somehow thought I was trying to get some free psychology. but anyway, that book
Well,
is
I think, Brian,
no longer available.
Hmm.
By the way, okay, go ahead.
so we must not concretize our fantasies. I think it's interesting that because then he goes on to say, but there is in man a strange propensity to do just this. And all his aversion to fantasy, et cetera, concretization and the fear of it are both primitive superstitions.
Mhm.
But then in the next paragraph, he's dialing in the scientific credo.
Right.
Has developed that. So it's like the teacherly piece, the academic piece is against the fantasy. Like, show your work, don't just put the answer down. And what's interesting is, the scientist will take it apart to put it back together, except some things you take apart, well, you just killed it. And the mystic will look at the whole thing at once and make the determination. So I think it makes a distinction between, old school Asclepius, healer kind of situation from a medical perspective. And you could speak to this better, but instead of all the diagnostics, there's literally the touch, the smell, the experience of a doctor understanding the general things going on and then testing for, to dial in. But the concretization being a superstition or the fear of it, basically the fear of bringing the golden cow out, so to speak. It's kind of curious. I don't know. It's just that paragraph. This paragraph's kind of curious. It feels like he's saying one thing, but somehow, ironically, going the other way without saying it. In a way.
Okay.
Any thoughts?
Well, obviously the metaphor is saying a heck of a lot without saying it.
Right.
And it's not necessarily something that you, Brian, would interact with, because this is what women dream typically, right? These are some of the topics that women dream about.
Yeah, as far as the poem, but I'm saying back to the
Yeah.
paragraph. But
Right.
So I'm just a little puzzled. So maybe it will unfold itself.
Well, I'm just saying that anything that comes out and becomes a work of art, now it's concretized. Okay. But if it's symbolic, then it's going to be extremely meaningful to people at many, 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 many different levels, right? It won't be a sign. It won't be like stop. It'll be.
Well, it's sharing fairy tale, sharing story, sharing fantasy. That, he's saying we have incredible propensity to have these unbelievable adventures and perform heroic deeds, but then we also have this same level of propensity of concretizing those. So of acknowledging them, the fear of the unknown, the fear of that which doesn't make sense, which personally I find to be a bogus fear. I mean, if it doesn't make sense, it's typically far more interesting. It's probably going to be pretty generative to get me to pick and play with it a bit.
Yeah, the metaphor I like is the one where I talk about seeing headlights on Interstate 95 going down the highway in the middle of the night. You see the taillights in front of you and the headlights coming on. And just that image is symbolic. It's symbolic of the fact that we can trust, in most cases, most of the time we go out driving, we can trust the fact that everybody is driving, no matter who taught them how to drive, they're going to drive safely. No matter what municipality set up the traffic rules in that jurisdiction, they will have set them up safely.
Maybe except in Massachusetts.
Pardon?
Maybe except in Massachusetts.
Well, and yeah. And
I learned this curious term. It starts with mass.
Yes, and a whole.
Yeah, exactly. But otherwise, the other 49 states, I think I would agree with you.
Right, but the point is that there's so many things that go behind that symbol, and we all can, most adults can drive down an interstate highway and feel quite comfortable and do it safely, no matter what the state of the other vehicles on the highway are, whether they're old or new, whether they're in good repair or bad repair, regardless of the age of the other drivers that are out on the highway. All those things are all bundled into that image, and you can see that symbol and know you're safe for the most part.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, if you pull an Aunt Hesh, then maybe not, but right. And so the unconscious has been concretized. It's been concretized in roads, in white lines down the road and dotted lines or yellow lines down the road. It's been concretized in all the equipment and et cetera. That's all concrete, but what's happening there is symbolic of something new, something unconscious that's happening within all of us all the time when we're driving. You know, there are always new drivers. There are always old drivers or drivers who are intoxicated. And you have this constant flow going on that's totally irrational. You know, you couldn't put a rational name on it, and yet it all works. Right.
Well, it's in a sense like blood cells, you know, but the thing is blood
Pardon?
cells, it's like blood cells in a way, you
Yeah.
know, except blood cells don't need auto insurance because the fast ones go in the left lane and the slow ones get passed on the right. So, I mean,
Right. Well, it's like our bodies. I mean, when we eat our dinner, we throw everything down this hole here, and our bodies figure out where we need the nutrients that go down into our stomach, and they just know how, you know, our body, all the parts of our body just know where all the parts go and what's needed and what's waste. You know, it's but anyway, okay, let's read on. Whose turn is it? Brian, you want to read 353?
Okay. As against this, the scientific credo of our time has developed a superstitious phobia about fantasy. But the real is what works, and the fantasies of the unconscious work. There can be no doubt about that. Even the cleverest philosopher can be the victim of a thoroughly idiotic agoraphobia. Our famous scientific reality does not afford us the slightest protection against the so-called irreality of the unconscious. Something works behind the veil of fantastic images, whether we give this something a good name or a bad. It is something real, and for this reason, its manifestations must be taken seriously. But first, the tendency to concretize must be overcome. In other words, we must not take the fantasies literally when we approach the question of interpreting them. While we are in the grip of the actual experience, the fantasies cannot be taken literally enough. But when it comes to understanding them, we must on no account mistake the semblance, the fantasy image as such, for the operative process underlying it. The semblance is not the thing itself, but only its expression. Okay.
Right. So,
What's
you know, that's right. So that's why I'm saying the semblance of the cars at night, the lights at night, is not what we're talking about. We're talking about an unconscious process that has happened historically, in the sense that old laws have been established in various jurisdictions, in the sense that everybody took a driver training class at some point, you know, that all cars were maintained in some way. But the process that's going on, the irrational process, lets us know that it's safe. You're safe in that circumstance, by and large. I mean, 99% of the time. I mean,
yeah, your example aligns with, and I appreciate the example in the context of, I think this is one of my more favorite lines, because he's basically saying, this is the importance of becoming fluent in the language of symbols and becoming fluent in your own visual language. You know, how you see, how you experience, learning tarot, not from a book, just read cards. I mean, I see Einstein's face in a tree, or, you know, I see, you know, a rabbit in a burrow pattern in a tree. Well, that's important. And I think he's making that statement here of the semblance, or the assemblage, as it were, of the image, that's the way the unconscious speaks. That's its language. And I think that that's an important piece here that people try to deride and go over, saying that doesn't make sense. So we're not going to use it. But the thing is, why are you doing experiments? That's kind of stupid to waste all that material. What do you, and it's not, but it's a similar kind of thing where he really is putting forth that the unconscious speaks in images, the unconscious speaks in symbols. And then that's where they can't be taken literally enough when you're in the experience to be able to receive clearly without translating, receive these images and you have that dance of the conversation with the images rather than with words.
Yeah. Right. So you can drive down the highway and you can try to visualize each of the other drivers on the highway. And, but if you're doing that, you're trying to concretize the irrational experience that you're having. And so, okay, you could write an encyclopedia on everybody that was out on the highway that day and all the facts about them and how they got to that point of to that place at that point of time and all that stuff, and that would all be rational, but it does not capture the experience. Right. Okay.
And well, it's interesting there, contrary to most opinions, I find driving at night, especially at speeds that are relatively high on highways, with no guardrails in between, driving at night to be safer because you get so much early warning if someone jumps a lane to pass, or if I'm going to need to dive to the shoulder just to create my own lane and just take that, just stay there. But during the day, even with daytime running lights, light in the daylight is too subtle to actually be a good solid marker as to context of something changing up ahead.
Right. I agree with you. Okay, 354. Let's go on.
So thus my patient is not experiencing the suicide scene on another plane, in quotes, though in every other respect, it is just as concrete as a real suicide. He experiences something real, which looks like a suicide. The two opposing, in quotes, realities, the world of the conscious and the world of the unconscious, do not quarrel for supremacy, but each makes the other relative. That the reality of the unconscious is very relative indeed will presumably arouse no violent contradiction, but that the reality of the conscious world could be doubted will be accepted with less alacrity. And yet, both realities are psychic experience, psychic semblances painted on an inscrutably dark backcloth. To the critical intelligence, nothing is left of absolute reality.
Right. And this is an important point that we're often having to cover here, which is that we're talking about experiences, okay, and you can never get the absolute reality. Okay, if you go down to different layers of the unconscious and start talking about the atoms that make up your brain, you can never get to the end of that, and yet those are all parts of absolute reality.
Well, even the idea of the electron microscopy, where the actual looking affects either speed, velocity, or is it velocity, direction, or location? And so you can only test for two. So you're going to intentionally try to screw up one to get information on the two. But the viewer experiencing the view affects the view because they can become part of the view in that sense. And I think that just 1, 2, 3, velocity, direction, or location is a good simple example of how dynamic and interdependent just experience is on even what's being experienced.
Right. And I also think that, the unconscious, when it engages us with image, is very much like this is inferring. It's not the thing. It's more like a charade of images is like this, or it's like this, it's like this. And it's because it's not talking in sentences, it's not talking in words, it's talking in images.
Right.
And the images are then in dynamic relationship with each other
Mhm.
in a process, telling a story. And to me, it's very much like a pantomime, if you will. And
Sure.
that's
Mhm.
different
Yeah,
than,
it's like charades, as you say. Yeah.
Yeah.
Very much
it-
so. It gives you an image, and it's like having the falling experience as a baby, and then sometimes it comes to us as adults.
Mhm.
We suddenly shake because we think we're falling, and we're not falling. It's just that's an old image that has been in the human psyche for probably since before there were humans.
Mhm.
and um and that image gets presented, and you have to react before you even think about it. I mean, you probably are asleep when it happens. Very often is the way it comes to me. It frequently happens in bed. By frequently, I say maybe 3 times a year or something like that.
Well, I think my understanding is that there are only 2 innate fears, and that's falling and loud noises. And personally, I mean, the loud noises, I cured that one right out, but the fear of falling, I mean, I don't know if I'll ever lose that. And then after my mountain experiences, so that honestly now when I'm going through an image set, even Pinterest or on the internet or something, and I see, they look over the edge of the bridge, I'm like, whoa, no. I literally will. I can't. I mean, I'll feel someone plugs the 220-volt cables into the back of my legs. Like, no, got to move that along. But it's interesting to me because I kind of wondered if I wouldn't have had the experience I've had on the mountain, if I would have been able to get rid of the fear of falling, or if the fear of falling is just a smart, primitive, unconscious thing to keep you from falling over the edge. So you literally
Absolutely.
keep safe.
Yeah, you would never get out of it. But anyway, paragraph 355. Of the essence of things, of absolute being, we know nothing, but we experience various effects from outside by the way of the senses, from inside by the way of fantasy. We would never think of asserting that the color green had an independent existence. Similarly, we ought never to imagine that a fantasy experience exists in and for itself and is therefore to be taken quite literally. It is an expression, an appearance standing for something unknown but real. The fantasy fragment I have mentioned coincides in time with a wave of depression and desperation, and this event finds expression in the fantasy. The patient really does have a fiance. For him, she represents one emotional link with the world. Snap that link, and it would be the end of his relation to the world. This would be an altogether hopeless aspect. But his fiance is also a symbol for his anima, that is, for his relation to the unconscious. Hence, the fantasy simultaneously expresses the fact that without any hindrance on his part, his anima is disappearing again into the unconscious. This aspect shows that once again, his mood is stronger than he is. It throws everything to the winds while he looks on without lifting a hand, but he could easily step in and arrest the anima. Yeah, maybe.
Hmm.
I if I could have arrested the anima, that would have happened when I was doing 5 sessions of marriage counseling before I left my first wife. But instead of that, I didn't get any help from that person. He just asked questions, and it made me think, oh my God, these guys are just plotters. Just tell me what, cut to the chase, please. Right. And or at least give me handrails so I know what we are supposed to be doing here. But his way of doing it would be to just ask questions and then leave you flopping around in your unconscious looking for, what was this guy driving at? And okay, he did activate some discussion between my ex-wife and me, but is that really what he should have been doing? I still don't know. And I've been thinking about it for 40 years, for crying out loud. Anyway, Brian, go ahead, 356.
I give preference to this latter aspect because the patient is an introvert whose life relationship is ruled by inner facts. Were he an extrovert, I would give preference to the first aspect because for the extrovert, life is governed primarily by his relation to human beings. He might, in the trough of a mood, do away with his fiancée and himself too, whereas the introvert harms himself most when he casts off relation to the anima, i.e., that is, to the object within.
I would never give up my anima. Sorry, I like her.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, that actually brings up a great point too. People say, "Oh, kill the ego." I'm like, you should not amputate any part of your psyche. They're saying it has a purpose.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
It's interesting though, his reference here to the difference of, and go figure. The introvert related to inner, the extrovert related to outer. It feels like if you ride the coastline, there's both of them are important. The balance of not being, stuck too far inside, stuck too far outside, but having honestly, Skip, you in Japan for 5 years. There's a robust exterior influence that, you get back here and, a private practice and, your small hometown kind of thing is not robust inside at all or outside. And so it feels that even drove potentially the decision. Not just that's boring, that's not what you want to do. The introvert being driven more by the inner and the extrovert being driven more by the external.
Yeah, and it was actually more than 5 years. It was 8 years, 3 years in high school, then a separation for 16 years, during which there were many fantasies and thoughts about Japan. And then 16 years after I left from high school, going back to Japan and living another 5 years. And actually having a lot of the things that I had fantasized about actually experienced them. I was too young to experience them when I was there in high school. I do want to read at least a couple of these comments. And I want to, because they compliment you. Jamie Perez says, very moving. Arid land reminds me of a distant desert. And then someone, Ting Ting Shiny, says, 3 wise men. And Jamie says, you could just participate, right? I'm not sure what he's referring to. But then the last comment here, which is the pièce de résistance, is, I'm learning so much. Thank you, wise men. Okay, so.
You're welcome. Much appreciated.
Yeah, it is appreciated because that's what all of us do this for, right?
Yeah.
It's
Totally.
not like, hmm?
I think along those lines, I mean, thank you very much. And along those lines, and back several paragraphs where Jung's talking about how, you're fishing the unconscious basically to enhance the conscious. I think that also just overlays very nicely with this paragraph about mining the introvert to bring things out to enhance the extrovert. So, I mean, using the inner to nourish the outer, which honestly, I'm thinking now that's probably why I've learned more from my garden than I have from almost anything, because
Probably.
it's putting out something that is generative, literally. And I like that, mining or fishing the unconscious is playing several paragraphs back to this introvert extrovert expression where they both have something to enhance the other with.
Yeah. By the way, I was reading in the Black Books, in Black Book Volume 1 today, and it reminded me that when Jung went to see Mountain Lake, it was in Taos where Jordan lives. And the interesting thing is Jamie D'Angelo, who was Carrie D'Angelo's husband, said that when Jung came to the U.S. that time, which was in 1925, if Jung hadn't agreed to go to Taos, he was going to kidnap him and make him go to Taos.
Nice. Well, what I love is I love that story, and then I love how so many of the facts are incorrect. It doesn't change the story. It's mostly names and titles, but the people, it's true. And that's what I love about the incorrectness, the things that are not factual, is that that's a wonderful Jungian way to look at those pesky little facts don't matter. This is like facts, damn facts, and statistics. I mean, kind of, because you change the fact that it was not an Indian chieftain; it was just a Native American. I think it was Blue Mountain Lake or something like that, or Blue Leaf Lake, whatever. But it wasn't a mountain, so conceptually. But I could, correct those terms. It wouldn't change the story at all.
No, it wouldn't change. That's
cool.
right.
But, and that Jung had the experience here. I didn't know that actually until I think right before. Maybe I knew it just right before I moved here, and from one of the sessions. And it was back for Lament of the Dead. That was still when I was back on the East Coast.
Yeah.
And I didn't know. It's like going to Taos, and all of a sudden, Jung's been there. Cool.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see. This is Jordan. This is you. 357.
So my patient's fantasy clearly reveals the negative movement of the unconscious, a tendency to recoil from the conscious world so energetically that it sucks away the libido from consciousness and leaves the latter empty. But by making the fantasy conscious, we stop this process from happening unconsciously. If the patient were himself to participate actively in the way described above, he would possess himself of the libido invested in the fantasy, and would thus gain added influence over the unconscious.
Yes.
Yeah.
Love it.
Okay, is it my turn?
Yes.
358, continual conscious realization of unconscious fantasies, together with active participation in the fantastic events, has, as I have witnessed in a very large number of cases, the effect, firstly, of extending the conscious horizon by the inclusion of numerous unconscious contents. Secondly, of gradually diminishing the dominant influence of the unconscious. And thirdly, of bringing about a change in personality. Okay, you want to comment on that, Brian?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that comes to me, not just the, being tree dwellers, we're the tree dwellers that were afraid of falling lived. Um, but there are these novel images and novel narrative, image on image on image, like just the image of flying in a dream is novel. It's made up, and yet
Sure.
it gives us the experience of flying, which none of us have done. We can't do it without apparatus,
Yeah.
yet it's there. And those kinds of things, that are maybe those kinds of things that are approaching the numinous or are numinous, that they have this effect of walking away without necessarily being able to explicitly give exposition to it, will change, will shift you,
Right.
will change you
Yeah.
in ways that nothing else could.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. That's for sure.
Well, it's interesting. I remember talking to someone this back in college about, we were talking about flying and dreams. And at one point I stopped and I said, wait a second, how do you take off and how do you fly in your dream? But all of a sudden I realized I just kind of went like this and popped up in the air and then took off. Or I would jump off a fence like Tom and Jerry, and right before I hit the ground, then I could fly. And it was interesting because then she said, oh no, I flap. I'm a bird. I soar and I flap. So it's interesting that, the modes of flight are probably as diverse as there are personalities, and
Yeah.
it's interesting. I think that, but you're right though, that it can shift you. And I've noticed that if I have a dream and I'm something like that, this is the way I do that. And then
Yeah.
I wake up and go, I was doing that. Whoa, I'd never done it like that before. And it gives you that kind of juice of just, what's new? What's changed? And that shift is, I think, pretty wicked cool. I mean, as to being reality, as it were.
I levitate.
There you go. How quaint. No, I'm just kidding. No, it is. That's another flight, and that's a whole different. Yeah, that's wow.
No, I've been in exactly this place in front of this house on a yacht once, and I levitated there. I got the yacht and me there.
Yeah, I swim.
You swim.
I don't flap. I don't do it Tom and Jerry. I swim.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
nice.
Okay. This change, 359. This change of personality is naturally not an alteration of the original hereditary disposition, but rather a transformation of the general attitude. Those sharp cleavages and antagonisms which conscious and between unconscious and unconscious, such as we see so clearly in the endless conflicts of neurotic natures, nearly always rest on a noticeable one-sidedness of the conscious attitude, which gives absolute precedence to one or two functions, while the others are unjustly thrust into the background. Conscious realization and experience of fantasies assimilates the unconscious inferior functions to the conscious mind, a process which is naturally not without far-reaching effects on the conscious attitude. Right. Well, one of the key things that is to be understood about individuation is that we do have a dominant side, whether it's sensing or intuitive, thinking or feeling, introverted, extroverted. But it's only when we can hold the opposites in consciousness that were close to individuation. Okay.
Mhm.
And I love
You know,
that he says that one-sidedness that speaks to that individuation piece that unjustly pushes the other functions to the background. And then so what happens is you're not playing with a full deck, so to speak. You know, you're
right.
not
And so
getting-
we see this very clearly in our politics where, you know, it comes out in various ways. It comes out in women who are adamant against the patriarchy and, you know, okay, yeah, but we have to hold hold both in consciousness, patriarchy and matriarchy. It's not a question of just let's put quicklime on the patriarchy and then everything will be hunky-dory. That's not the way it works, right? We have to have a central view,
and evolutionary passage, like leaving adolescence, is a good example in terms of politics. You know,
Right.
and grow up and be adults instead of squabbling little tantrum throwing children. You know, I mean,
right.
there's
Right. And so it's so clear in our politics right now where we have to stop being red and blue. We have to be purple.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
if we can be purple, you know, we're going to see what happens in Liz Cheney's primary tomorrow. And if even if she loses, I think that she will run
Yeah.
as an independent, very likely. That's what Lisa Murkowski did in Alaska. She was defeated in the Republican primary 6 years ago, and she just said, well, screw you, I'm going to run as an independent. And she won. And you know, in terms of the Republican current, or the red state current pablum, you know, contemporary wisdom is that she'll lose her seat in Congress, but I don't believe that at all. She may not be nominated by whatever they call the Republican Party right now, or whatever the Republican Party is right now, but I think it's very likely that if she runs as an independent, she'll win her election in November, regardless of the primary.
Or might even be a contender in the presidential.
exactly
That could happen too, whether or not she wins the congressional seat. You know, losing the congressional seat might be a blessing in disguise because it lets her garner her strength for the 2024 presidential election. I mean, both my wife and I think we might well vote for her. You know, although, you know, I took an oath that I would never, ever vote for another Republican for the rest of my life. I actually have taken such an oath. But if she were to be a candidate in 2024, I might do it.
But you may have to be an independent.
She might have to run as an independent, right? And she might.
I think what's interesting to me, mostly about Liz Cheney, it's not that she's not left and not right. And I don't find her to be centrist. I find her to be robust, insightful, and clear. And she's not afraid of leaning into, you know, lean into the dissonance. And she will lean in, and she's got a clear and evolved, and I hate to say this, but it's necessary in the political context, adult voice.
Yep. A grown-up, mature voice.
You know, and it's sad that we have to use that adjective. You know, you would assume that the ages in the Constitution at which you're allowed to run for, that you might have stopped pupating by then, but no, it doesn't seem to be the case.
Oh, I can't wait to see what happens when Amanda Gorman is of age. She's not even old enough to run for Congress right now, but
Right.
good grief, what happens when she's old enough?
Yeah.
Because she is just such a put together individual. She's a mighty mite, and she is a put together individual.
Yeah.
And okay, so Brian, 360.
For the moment, I will refrain from discussing the nature of this change of personality, since I only want to emphasize the fact that an important change does take place. I have called this change, which is the aim of our analysis of the unconscious, the transcendent function. This remarkable capacity of the human psyche for change, expressed in the transcendent function, is the principal object of late medieval alchemical philosophy, where it was expressed in terms of alchemical symbolism. Herbert Silberer, in his very able book, Problems of Mysticism and its Symbolism, has already pointed out the psychological content of alchemy. It would be an unpardonable error to accept the current view and reduce these alchemical strivings to a mere matter of alembics and melting pots. This side certainly existed. It represented the tentative beginnings of exact chemistry. But alchemy also had a spiritual side, which must not be underestimated and whose psychological value has not yet been sufficiently appreciated. There was an alchemical philosophy, the groping precursor of the most modern psychology. The secret of alchemy was in fact the transcendent function, the transformation of personality through the blending and fusion of the noble with the base components, of the differentiated with the inferior functions, of the conscious with the unconscious.
Right.
So that to me, that brings us to the point of, it also means that we must meet and embrace our inner insurrectionist, and
Absolutely.
our inner Donald Trump, and
Yep.
our inner, whatever it is, whatever your bugaboo is.
Yeah, that's why I'm reading this book,
Mhm.
because you have to embrace your inner self and see what George Orwell was talking about.
Right, but your inner Putin, your inner Stalin, right?
Absolutely,
your inner Hitler.
absolutely. Yeah.
And also your inner 7 alchemical stages of the process. I mean, when he's talking, he spent 3 or 4 paragraphs in a row with the example about depression. And, and what's interesting though, he's saying, don't waste trouble. You face it, stay in it. It's like, it's the lull, calm before the storm, or, the lull. You're gonna wash up on your shore, but instead of trying to run away from it and then make it worse, I mean, so you're right. You have to enter Putin, enter Stalin.
Right. And we're not, next week we'll finish this, and then in the following week start talking about the mana personality. But just to end this is some little part of something. I want to offer you a wonderful paragraph from the mana personality here, which we'll be getting to in 3 or 4 weeks. On psychological grounds, therefore, I would recommend that no God be constructed out of the archetype of the mana personality. In other words, he must not be concretized, for only thus can I avoid projecting my values and non-values into God and devil, and only thus can I preserve my human dignity, my specific gravity, which I need so much if I am not to become the unresisting shuttlecock of unconscious forces. In his dealings with the visible world, a man must certainly be mad to suppose that he is the master of this world. Here we follow quite naturally the principle of non-resistance to all superior forces up to a certain individual limit, beyond which the most peaceful citizen becomes a bloody revolutionary. Our bowing down before law and order is a commensurable example of what our general attitude of the collective unconscious should be. Render under Caesar that which is Caesar's, blah, blah. Thus far, our obeisance would not be too difficult, but there are other factors in the world to which our conscience does not give unqualified assent, and yet we bow to them. Why? Because in practice it is more expedient than the reverse. Similarly, there are factors in the unconscious with regard to which we must be worldly wise. So I'm going to leave it at that for now. But the important sentence here is, here we follow quite naturally the principle of non-resistance to all superior forces up to a certain individual limit, beyond which the most peaceful citizen becomes a bloody revolutionary. And so we could apply this to Republicans who have, followed the path of least resistance with Trump, bum, 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 bum. But all of a sudden, there's a limit that's reached, and either 2 years from now, he'll either be the Republican candidate for president, or nobody will admit to ever having known him.
Right.
Can you run for president from prison?
No.
I don't think it's spoken to in the Constitution. So
I
I
don't
think
think it-
No, I don't think he can, though. I think there are state laws which prevent it.
there's a write-in
You know-
candidate.
Brian,
Huh?
I like. What's that?
I said, but as a write-in candidate, maybe he can't get on the ballot himself. But
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
No, as I say, I love it. When you said, find our own personal boogaboos, and it's
right.
interesting because I last week someone was, he was over there. He just overheard across, loud enough so that anyone in the 500-foot radius could have heard it. But all I thought was, he doth protest a little too much. Like he's
Mhm.
confessing that, that's actually a desire kind of thing. But then as I was walking away, I went, so what do I protest too much? And it became that quick forensic of, the boogaboo of
Mhm.
what actually gets my goat. And, and it's, I like that exercise because you don't want to get too, the air's too thin if you're on too high a horse, way
Oh.
too high up in the air. Come down here, the air's a little, better. But yeah, the boogaboos, it's like that's important to keep us, not just keep us honest. I think it keeps us robust because you have that, that's not a very nice quality. I could work on that.
Yeah, they're all people. They all have had parents. They all,
Yeah.
many of them have children. They have jobs. They're people,
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. They're people.
Right.
And that's it.
So
they're-
Amila says, my aunt always says you can put lipstick on a pig, but a pig is still a pig.
Yeah.
And,
Yes, absolutely.
Actually, my
I'm
grandmother,
not saying not to lose to live a lie. I'm saying
right.
that the truth includes the fact that I have
Yeah.
banished, the cheat and the I don't know, the traitor and and the bombast. And Trump is the perfect hook for all that stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you see this last image?
Bring it forward a touch.
Well, wait a minute. I'll stop my
Yeah,
screen, my
Put
virtual
lipstick on a pig,
background.
but still can't fly. It's like,
Take a close look at this image. This is the last image in Animal Farm. Can you
Right.
tell which ones are the pigs and which ones are the men?
No, well, maybe.
I can see one pig on the
The
left
man
side.
on the
Two
left.
pigs, three
The
pigs.
man
in a
on the
portrait.
left with the lipstick is a pig.
I see on my right, your left, a pig. Then there's a pig over on the other side, and there's a portrait of a pig. And then there's very piggy looking men.
Yeah,
Yeah,
they're very piggy looking men. And are we judging them by
Right.
their noses? I mean,
Yeah,
that's
wow,
that's a big one.
it is.
right. So this is the sentence that both this book and Mr. Jones, which is the movie that I recommended to everybody last week, I think,
Yes.
which was the book Animal Farm interlaces with that movie, and both of them end with this sentence: the creatures outside looked from pig to man and from man to pig and from pig to man again, but already it was impossible to say which was which.
Right.
Yeah, that it's interesting because that reminds me of the 14th century philosopher Croce. If man were not similar, man could not discern man from beast. If man were not dissimilar, man could not discern man from man. But what I like about that is, and then it's the important pieces have kind of left the building.
Yeah.
Right. So Jamie says he's interested in my individual limit thing. He says that is super relevant right now, especially for young men. Certain individual limit. Interesting. Would he mean the lacking capability to make things conscious or concretized? No, I think, you can just take, everybody has a limit about how much bullshit they'll take. And then, that's the end of it.
Yeah.
No, I'm not going to go there, but
I,
the point, I guess the point would be that, I think for the most part, I put forth a fairly mild demeanor here. But I would, people should not test my limits. Right.
well, I think that's a great example to kind of parlay into Winston Churchill's interview question in regards to that limit of bullshit and of persona, when he says, well, sir, tell me about your vices. And he wasn't trying to make him feel bad. He was just figuring out, what should I stock the cabinets with, and what damage control out there do I need to do so that, your predilections are kept, yours, kept out of the public. Oh, he was just doing damage control. And the person says, well, Mr. Prime Minister, I'm an upstanding gentleman. I have no vices. And Winston Churchill just bellows laughter. And the man says, well, what's so funny? He said, look, either you're a liar or you are in fact actually that boring, and I can have neither of those two qualities on my cabinet.
Right.
So the whole persona of he had no vices, he thought he was being a good little boy, so to speak, instead of
right. So Jamie, I would say that it does not mean a lack of a capability to make things conscious or concretized. I think what it means is that we're all different, and we all of our psyches and our opinions are fed by a lifetime of whatever it is. And we don't know where the limit is in any one individual. We're all sticks of dynamite with the fuse lit. Okay, all of us. And when we're meeting someone new, maybe this doesn't happen so much when we've known people for years and years, but when we're meeting someone new, we don't know where the limits are, right?
Hi, Dr.
Um,
George.
Pardon? Oh, okay. So we're not going to go into this. We're not going to go into this, Jordan, but you and I know where our limits are, right?
Well, no, I was gonna say, there's a whole piece there, and, at the same time, they weren't cracked. They were pushed, bent, and then there they are. I mean, and the thing is, that comes back down to the honesty and integrity of, this is exactly what's going on right now, and we're gonna deal with exactly what's going on right now. I mean,
Right.
and that's,
it's not, a fixed thing. It's not concretized. Because
But
it
it's
can't be
clear.
concretized because it depends on the situation and the terrain. I muted you, Brian, so that you can unmute.
I was actually talking to the resident, so, okay.
Okay. All
Thanks
right. Well, I'm going to let you all go because it's after 10 and I've been putting in a hard day today. So,
Good to
so
see
I'll
you guys.
see you
well, it's a
on
pleasure.
Wednesday, Jordan, and Brian, I hope we see you next Sunday. You can certainly come on Wednesday too, but
Yeah, I
know
may
you're
not
probably-
be here next Sunday, this coming
Uh-huh.
Sunday.
Okay.
Okay. But
Jordan and I will continue
Carry
to
on.
hold forth.
Carry on.
We're having fun.
Yeah.
So far anyway.
It's answer to
working out.
Job. I mean, it's answer to Job. It's one of those, if you ever feel really bad about yourself, just read him and you'll feel a lot better about yourself.
Yeah. But but the answer is, God said, I'm going to give you new children, I'll give you new children. and that's what Krishna says to Arjuna too, basically. Don't worry about the ones you kill. I'll give you new ones.
Freshly sourced, local and organic children, straight from God. Oh wait, that's for the witches. The freshly sourced for the children for the pie.
Yeah, so nice to see everybody tonight.